On Thursday, the 25th of May in 2023, a 40-year-old man named Emilio Ghanem was driving his rented pickup truck through the inland empire of California on a mission to attract some new clients for his pest control business, when suddenly he would stop responding to his messages. After a few weeks had passed with no contact from Emilio, his family started to become concerned, so it wasn't long before his sister Jenny would officially report him missing to the local authorities. During the investigation, it was soon discovered that Emilio had recently walked away from his California-based religion, known as His Way Spirit-led Assemblies, after 23 years, to begin a fresh new life with his family over in Nashville, Tennessee, where he would soon create his very own pest control company. So, determined to make this new business venture a success, after a few months of preparation, he eventually decided to head back out west to speak to some of his previous clients about future business proposals. However, after just 2 weeks of prospecting, the 40-year-old man would suddenly disappear, and his case would fall silent for years, with many believing he could have decided to return back to his old life, especially as one witness claimed Emilio was planning to meet with a member of the church later that day. But just when his family began to lose hope that they would ever find out the truth, the police would announce in 2025 that they had arrested multiple people, including the leader of His Way Spirit-led Assemblies, a 62-year-old woman named Shelley Martin, and subsequently charged her with murder. However, it would soon be revealed that these arrests were not just in relation to Emilio's case, but also a series of other disappearances, leaving both Emilio's family and the wider community understandably devastated, as they are only left to wonder, what really happened to Emilio Ghanem, and how many other victims could this California cult be responsible for? Emilio Ghanem was born in 1983 in the city of Nashville, Tennessee, where he grew up with devoted parents and a loving sister named Jennifer. Little was known about his family life, but as Emilio started to move into his later teenage years, something appeared to have led him to seek a higher power, with his sudden admission into the Assemblies of God religion at the age of just 17. For now, we can only speculate, but it would seem that this abrupt enlightening may have started during Emilio's first full-time job as a sales rep for the lawn care company True Green, as based on his LinkedIn page, it would appear that both journeys started in the year 2000. But either way, it wasn't long before Emilio began to outgrow his position within the company, and soon set his eyes on a brand new role, working as a route manager for the pest control company Terminix. Now, although this may not have been the most glamorous job, it paid very well, and with Emilio only being 19 at the time, it was a great opportunity to build his career. And luckily, this decision would prove to be a good one, as he remained with Terminix for 12 long years, until he would once again reach the end of his line. The problem was, although Emilio loved his job, he couldn't quite see a future with Terminix, with promotions always seeming to pass him by. So, after much deliberation, he eventually decided to move on from his position to seek out a more customer-facing role, and his company of choice would end up being the newly founded Full Shield Incorporated. Now, it is important to note that this was an enormous decision for Emilio, as Full Shield were based all the way out in California, so he would be leaving behind his entire family as well as his church in Tennessee. But seeing as they were a new company on the rise, and he would be given a lot of responsibility, Emilio couldn't help but accept their offer, with distant hopes of one day using his knowledge to start his own business. So, at the relatively young age of 30, Emilio packed up all of his worldly belongings and headed out west to make a fresh start in California. As the years went by, it seemed that Emilio was starting to settle, as he had already established himself within a local church, known as His Way Spirit-led Assemblies, as most of his work colleagues also followed the God of Assemblies religion. So I think it would be safe to say that Emilio was quite happy with his new life, as he would continue to build on his career with Full Shield for the next 9 years. Well, that was until April of 2023, when his demeanour suddenly changed. It was no secret that Emilio had long-term plans of running his own business one day, but it was assumed by his family that this would be at some point in the distant future. So when they received an unexpected call from Emilio claiming to be leaving the church and coming home, they were extremely concerned. The now 40-year-old man had been living in California for almost 10 years, so it was certainly a surprise to hear that he had suddenly denounced his beliefs and quit his job with Full Shield, a company he'd been so loyal to. But at the same time, his family were quietly thrilled about the prospect of having Emilio home, so without hesitation, they welcomed him back with open arms. After his return, it wasn't long before Emilio began constructing his very own pest control business in Tennessee, with the long-term goal of becoming a nationwide corporation with offices scattered all over the country. But before he could make these dreams become a reality, the first step for Emilio was to get his new business off the floor. So with the help of some friends, he eventually settled on the catchy yet professional company name of Max Shield. And then, after a solid business model was agreed, it wasn't long after that Emilio's company seemed to quickly take off, with many locals in Tennessee claiming to be interested in using the service. But despite the initial success of Max Shield, Emilio still wanted more, and so soon enough, he began scouring his phone book for more potential clients that he could bring on board, no matter what the cost, which was understandably met with concern by his family, as they had noticed how hard he had been working already. However, despite their fears, Emilio's family couldn't have been prepared for what would happen next, as this rather forceful business plan would soon develop into something much more dangerous, when Emilio would spontaneously decide to head back to California. On Monday, the 15th of May, the 40-year-old pest controller said goodbye to his family as he set off for a 2-week business trip across the inland empire of California. At the time, Emilio appeared to be in high spirits, as it had only been a few weeks since he had officially started his company, so he was excited to put his new business plan into action. However, there was no way he could have been completely comfortable, as just a week prior to his trip, he had received a cease and desist letter from his previous employer, Full Shield Incorporated. Apparently, in the weeks building up to his business trip, Emilio had been speaking with his former clients over the phone in an effort to get them on board with his new enterprise. So it was safe to say his seemingly harmless attempts at recruiting business were being viewed as much more than just healthy competition by his ex-employers. The cease and desist letter contained threats of legal action against Emilio if he was to continue, also implying that the ex-employee had been bad-mouthing the company and would therefore be liable for any damages caused to their business. However, despite the possible legal repercussions, Emilio refused to be bullied by Full Shield and continued to speak to his former clients, as he had wider intentions of setting up a satellite office in the Inland Empire. Anyway, after arriving in Nashville International Airport that morning, he caught a midday flight to Las Vegas, as he had planned to rent a vehicle and drive the rest of the journey to California. After a successful flight, he then collected a white Nissan Frontier pickup truck for his travels and headed for an Airbnb in Moreno Valley, where he intended to stay for the duration of his trip. However, what he didn't realize at the time was that this decision to travel across the country would soon reveal itself to be a tragic mistake, as just 10 days later, he would suddenly go missing without a trace. On Thursday, the 25th of May, Emilio woke up in his Moreno Valley Airbnb ready to start the day, with plans to see a potential customer in the neighbouring city of Redlands. In the previous 9 days, he had sat down with several former clients to discuss his business operations, where he received a relatively positive response from most. But I think it would be safe to assume he must have been starting to feel the heat, with his previous company Full Shield only being located a short drive away. Nevertheless, despite any feelings of doubt, he left the apartment at some point in the morning and headed off for the meeting, where he was later caught on surveillance cameras entering a Starbucks in Redlands. By all accounts, he was only inside for a few minutes until he eventually emerged from the doors with a coffee in hand before walking back in the direction of his truck. But rather hauntingly, this would be the last official sighting of Emilio Ghanem, as just 1 week later, the 40-year-old pest controller would fail to catch his return flight to Nashville. On Monday, the 29th of May, the Ghanem family were eagerly waiting at the security gates of Nashville International Airport, hoping to surprise Emilio as he got off the plane. The flight was due to arrive at some point in the evening, but disturbingly, day soon turned to night, with still no sign of Emilio at the airport. Jennifer Ghanem in particular was already quite concerned for her brother, given that she had not heard from him in 4 days, but she had silently hoped that he was just too busy for communication, knowing how determined he was with his new business. But after waiting around at the airport for nearly 3 hours, the family eventually decided to head home, assuming that Emilio had maybe got on a later flight or had decided to stay in California for a little longer. However, after 2 more days went by with Emilio still failing to communicate with anybody, including his work colleagues back in Nashville, Jennifer knew something was very wrong, and eventually decided she had no other choice than to report her 40-year-old brother as missing to the Redlands Police Department. On Wednesday the 31st of May, the police officially started their investigation into the disappearance of Emilio Ghanem, after being notified by the family that he had not been in contact for almost an entire week and had missed his return flight. They then started their search at his Airbnb in Moreno Valley, where they would soon discover a normal apartment which contained pretty much all of Emilio's belongings except for his rented pickup truck. So, based on this discovery, the initial consensus was that he was likely still in the area but was just spending most of his time elsewhere. But determined to cover all their bases, the Redlands police then decided to check local surveillance footage to see if they could explicitly confirm his safety. However, as they were meticulously scouring through hundreds of hours of camera footage, they soon realised that Emilio, along with his rental truck, had not been spotted anywhere in either Redlands or Moreno Valley for weeks. But with the knowledge that his last known contact had occurred on the 25th of May, the police honed in on this time period and spread the radius of their surveillance footage search, hoping to get more information on where and when he disappeared. And soon enough, they spotted Emilio's white Nissan Frontier pickup truck on Linden Avenue in the neighbouring city of Colton. Now, this wasn't too surprising at the time, as Emilio was travelling across the Inland Empire and therefore would likely be conducting meetings all over the region. However, mild concern soon developed into serious fears for Emilio's safety, as the police continued to come up empty in their search for the missing 40-year-old man. But despite the already low morale amongst the investigators, matters somehow only worsened when detectives attempted to speak to some of Emilio's old friends from the His Way Spirit-led Assemblies church, only to have the doors slammed in their face. On Wednesday the 21st of June, Redlands police turned up at the His Way Spirit-led Assemblies headquarters, where they had hoped to gather some potential information from people who would have known Emilio quite well. However, they would soon be shocked when their attempts to make contact were met with nothing more than silence, as the followers would continue to ignore the efforts of the police. Now, rather suspiciously, the headquarters was only located a short drive away from where Emilio's truck was last seen in Colton. So, in response to the lack of cooperation from the church, the Redlands police started to become concerned that he may have been kidnapped by the group. But without any probable cause to allow them entry into the facility, the authorities were unable to address their concerns, and so instead set their targets on Full Shield Incorporated, as they were also heavily connected to Emilio, and their headquarters were located even closer to where the pickup truck was last seen. But frustratingly, once again they were met with both silence and ignorance, with employees claiming to know nothing about Emilio or his whereabouts. So, after months of intense searching, the Redlands Police Department were eventually forced to go back to the Ghanem family empty-handed. However, despite this disappointing update, the investigation was far from over, as in the background, detectives were continuing to monitor Emilio's ex-colleagues, just waiting for someone to slip up. And sure enough, after biding their time and waiting for several years to build up a solid case, the police would eventually strike when it was least expected, blowing this cold case wide open. On Wednesday the 27th of August in 2025, detectives revealed that after locating the rented pickup truck Emilio had been driving during his final trip to California, inside they discovered evidence significant enough to change the trajectory of the case entirely. With this discovery, search warrants were issued and the authorities descended on several properties affiliated with His Way Spirit-led Assemblies. One of those warrants was served at a Hemet property believed to function as the group's headquarters, led by so-called prophetess Shelley Catherine Martin and her husband, a senior pastor within the organisation. where investigators were able to recover useful evidence at every location searched. On the same day, 2 individuals that were both confirmed to be affiliated with the religious group were arrested just blocks away from the Hemet property. But to add to the controversy, additional warrants were carried out at a remote Anza residence, a location neighbours had described as heavily stocked with survival supplies, as preparation for some kind of doomsday scenario. However, despite the wealth of evidence that had been brought forward against this organisation, when detectives attempted to question members of the group, they were once again met with resistance, with some members refusing to speak altogether. But regardless of their attempts to keep quiet, the scope of the investigation was expanding, when police confirmed that they were also re-examining the disappearance of another former member of the church, a man named Ruben Moreno, who vanished back in 2017 after last being seen at a residence connected to the same group. For investigators, the similarities were impossible to ignore, and so what had once appeared to be a single unexplained disappearance was beginning to look like part of something much larger. And as arrests were made and evidence mounted, one thing became clear. The wall of silence surrounding His Way spirit-led assemblies was finally starting to crack. However, the public were still not satisfied, as these arrests were still awaiting charges, and so every day that passed was another day that the suspects could cover their tracks, with assistance from the wider members of the church. But after months of silence, the police would once again announce to the public that there had been another major update in the case, an update that would take the community one step closer to justice. On Wednesday the 17th of December, 4 months on from the initial arrests, authorities would announce that the case into Emilio Ghanem's disappearance had officially been reclassified as a homicide. After years of intense investigation, prosecutors would finally reveal that multiple members of His Way spirit-led assemblies were now facing murder charges, alleging that Emilio was killed after attempting to permanently break free from the group. At the centre of the case was Shelley Cat Martin, the group's self-described prophetess and one of its highest-ranking leaders. Prosecutors allege that Martin played a direct role in orchestrating the events that led to Emilio's death, using the group's structure, loyalty and control to isolate him during his final days. Authorities say that Emilio believed he was meeting with a high-ranking member of the ministry to help that person leave the group. Investigators now believe that the meeting was a setup, a calculated ruse designed to lure Emilio away from anyone who could protect him. According to prosecutors, evidence recovered from Emilio's rental truck, combined with digital records, witness testimony from former members, and material seized during multiple search warrants, painted a picture of a deliberate and coordinated act, not a disappearance, but a killing. Officials also revealed that Emilio's case was no longer being viewed in isolation, because as part of the same investigation, authorities denounced murder charges connected to the death of a 4-year-old child, whose life was tragically taken while under the care of the group more than a decade earlier. That revelation fundamentally changed the scope of the case, transforming it from a single tragedy into an alleged pattern of abuse, control, and lethal consequences for those who fell under the group's influence. For Emilio's family, the announcement brought a painful mix of relief and devastation. After more than 2 years of unanswered questions, investigators were finally saying out loud what many had feared from the very beginning. Emilio Ghanem didn't just vanish, he was silenced. However, the one silver lining that remains is that after 2 years and 7 months, Emilio's family finally have some closure on the situation, while the guilty suspects are left to rot in a jail cell as they await their sentencing. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. But given the recent murder charges that have been announced, we can hold out hope that the guilty suspects will be brought to justice once and for all, as their dark secrets are finally laid bare and their murderous cult is deservedly torn apart. The fact that Emilio is not the only victim is a tragic and eye-opening revelation that nobody expected, but I am truly grateful that the authorities didn't give up their investigation, as it may very well lead to the discovery of more victims, providing much-needed closure to those who are still waiting for answers. However, as we wait for the sentencing, there are still a number of questions which remain unanswered, such as how and why Emilio was targeted, and whether or not other members of the church have suffered a similar fate. So with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, just before we get into the theories themselves, I just wanted to take a moment to reflect on the reality of what has taken place here, as it's easy to get caught up in the details of an investigation and forget about those who are most affected by these types of cases. The truth is, regardless of who was responsible or what their intentions were, a man has been murdered, and a family have lost a loved one after years of searching for answers. So I feel it's important that we acknowledge their suffering as a reminder that these videos are much more than just a collection of stories, but real events that have real-life consequences, with families and friends who are forever impacted by the actions of dangerous individuals. So, out of respect for them, I will approach these theories with as much empathy and sensitivity as possible, focusing only on ideas that stem from statements made by Emilio's family and information released by law enforcement. Also, while some theories may appear more likely than others, we must remember that until concrete evidence emerges, they remain nothing more than speculation. But with that being said, one of the most widely considered explanations for what happened to Emilio is that he was lured out by a leader of the church who was claiming to want to leave as well, but this may have been a setup in order to trap Emilio. Perhaps they initially could have tried to convince him to join back and work together with the church, but after Emilio refused, they decided they had no choice but to kidnap him or even take his life then and there. Now, there is of course no way of knowing this for sure, however the fact that it has taken over 2 years to find out the truth tells me that they likely kept him prisoner for a period of time before they took his life, because in the time Emilio was missing, the church were somehow able to gain ownership of his new company, which implies that they were able to force him into signing it away. It will be interesting to see what the police reveal next, as if they follow the paper trail, they may be able to prove that this is in fact what happened. However, we must also keep in mind that perhaps there is no single theory we can attribute to this case, but in reality it was just an amalgamation of several factors. It could have started off as a meaning of stopping Emilio, but then tensions were raised when he refused, leading to an argument that turned physical before Emilio was ultimately killed. If this is the case, then the defendant lawyers will likely try to convince the jury that this was nothing more than manslaughter and a crime of passion, but the fact that they tried to cover it up alongside the other mysterious disappearances that occurred around the same time, I think they will have a very difficult job convincing a jury that this was anything other than a premeditated attack, which was likely orchestrated by the church themselves. However, once again, I must clarify that the points I'm making here are nothing more than speculation, as the police have only released statements pertaining to charges of murder without any of the other details. So for now, all we can do is wait for the authorities to reveal the whole truth by providing the community with answers, and providing complete closure to a family who have been patiently waiting for almost 3 years. But just before I end the video, I think it's important that we also mention some of the other cases that have been wrapped up in this story, as Emilio isn't the only victim here. In fact, as well as the 4-year-old child who police say died as a result of neglect from the church, there are also multiple other cases of victims coming forward to speak their truths about the church and its manipulating ways. There have been disappearances linked to the church, such as Ruben Moreno, who vanished back in 2017 after he was last seen at a Claremont residence connected to the group. Coincidentally, Ruben is also the brother of one of the suspects who have been charged with Emilio's murder, which has led police to re-examine his case in light of the recent discoveries. But as well as these cases, there have also been other victims of the church to come forward, as they finally feel safe to speak about their experiences. In fact, as the murder charges were announced, a man named Anthony Duran finally came forward with a story that has already helped explain how Emilio Ghanem's disappearance could have happened. Anthony says he joined the group as a teenager after his family uprooted their entire lives to move to Southern California. What he encountered, he claims, was not simply a church, but a tightly controlled environment where leaders dictated nearly every aspect of daily life. According to Anthony, members lived communally, worked exclusively for church-owned businesses, and were discouraged or sometimes outright forbidden from finishing school, earning an independent income, or maintaining relationships outside of the church. Those who questioned authority were told they were disobeying God himself and were consequently disciplined by the leaders. Again, according to Anthony, Shelley Martin was at the centre of this group, known internally as the Prophetess. She was believed by members to be the sole conduit through which God spoke, so her words were treated as unquestionable truth. Anthony describes homes guarded around the clock, members tasked with watching for perceived threats, as well as an atmosphere of constant fear, not of outsiders, but of disobedience. More chillingly, Anthony says he lived alongside both Emilio Ghanem and Ruben Moreno, two men who would later vanish after attempting to leave the group. When members asked where Ruben had gone, Anthony claims they were told not to ask questions, but that he was on a mission from God, which is a detail that carries enormous weight with the investigators. Now, thankfully, Anthony eventually escaped in the year 2020, leaving with little more than clothes in trash bags. But since then, he says the cost of leaving has been devastating, including being completely cut off from family members who remain inside the group. So, with these details in mind, what does this mean for Emilio? Well, what we do know for certain is that he had recently cut ties with the church, left its business interests, and was succeeding independently, even contacting former clients the group believed belonged to them. So it's no surprise that investigators believe this paints a very disturbing pattern, and for the first time, the public is learning about what life inside His Way's spirit-led assemblies was really like, and why walking away may have been far more dangerous than anyone realized. But anyway, for now, that's where I'm going to leave this case. As the legal process moves forward, many of the answers surrounding Emilio Ghanem and the other victims connected to this story will ultimately have to be decided in a courtroom. However, if you have any thoughts or perspectives of your own that you believe might add some context as to what may have happened, you're welcome to share them respectfully in the comments down below. But with that being said, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video, and if you'd like to stay updated on this case as it continues to unfold, please subscribe to the channel for future developments. Also, if you found this video informative, feel free to check out the playlist on screen now, which covers the many other cases of people who have disappeared across America in recent years, some of which are still unsolved to this day.